Hi, BookTube. Welcome. Welcome to another Middlemarch meditation. That means it's the third week in January. Oh, yeah, really. Anyway, let's just get into it. I think that will just help January go a bit faster, won't it? First of all, an amusing little story. I'm not talking about big guffaw laughs, just you might smile. But I got an interesting comment from Elfie Austin 3709. She doesn't make content of her own, but she watches a lot of mine, makes a lot of really good comments. We've had conversations going back and forth, which is, I just love that. But it's funny. She went back and she was watching Middlemarch episode number 6. So that was the one, it was around the time that Celia and Dorothea were looking at their mother's jewels, thereabouts. And Elfie noticed, I'm just going to read her comment because it's so funny. She just says, completely superfluous to make this comment now, 1 year later, but I thought it was so funny, and I don't mean this in a nasty way, and of course you didn't, of course you did, that you read spilt needles, sorry, no, let's back up. She says, you read split needles where it says spilt needles. It gives the scene an extra meaning. Eliot would like it, I think. Oh, I don't know. I don't want to ask George Eliot now that I have misread her text, but it was funny. I went back and found the passage in question and read it through again and remembered at the time that, yes, I did think that I was reading the word split instead of spilt. And it struck me odd. I thought, what, did people split needles in the 19th century? I didn't have time to look this up. What did she mean by split needles? I mean, I suppose, of course, in theory, a split needle would be even tinier than a whole needle. And therefore, yes, very hard to see, very dangerous. Anyway, I was laughing at myself because it shows, well, it proves that I sight read. It proves the idea that really good readers do sight read, and that sometimes that sight reading, you still make mistakes. So yeah, I just wanted to say that because Elfie, I found it really funny to see that I'd done that. And I do that a lot. I mean, I know when I'm editing the videos afterwards, I catch other misreadings. And sometimes I think, oh, shall I re-record that? But I mean, it would literally take so much time. I'm hoping that you all, not that you can't comment on it, because you sure can. I will find it just as amusing as you will. But I'm hoping that you all kind of allow for a little bit of that. I try to be as accurate as I possibly can. So anyway, enough of the frivolous stuff. Now we got to get on. We're starting book 2 called Old and Young. And when you're starting a book, things are kind of gearing up again. And that's what this chapter feels like a little. I'm probably going to be reading a lot more from other people, or at least as much from other people as I am of the book itself, because the first pages that we're going to do page 123 through to the top part of 127. I didn't really have a great deal to comment on, but I did find other resources with some fantastic ideas, so I'm gonna share them. That's how we're gonna work this meditation. And we're going to start, as so many of Eliot's chapters do, with our epigraph. Let's read this one. It's not an easy one to understand. It's dialogue between first gentleman and second gentleman, so we know that she invented all of these. First gentleman, how class your man? As better than the most, or seeming better, worse beneath that cloak? As saint or knave, pilgrim or hypocrite? Second gentleman, nay, tell me how you class your wealth of books, the drifted relics of all time. As well sort them at once by size and livery, vellum, tall copies, and the common calf will hardly cover more diversity than all your labels cunningly devised to class your unread authors. What on earth does all that mean? It's not the clearest writing I ever read. And so I'm going to refer you'll see a link in the description box it's an open book, by the way. It's brought out by Open Book Publishers, and we've covered it before. It's a book by a guy called Adam Roberts, and the title is Middlemarch, Epigraphs and Mirrors. And Adam Roberts goes through all the epigraphs in Middlemarch and expands on them. And I think you might remember the unskinned bear. He helped us a lot with that quotation. So let's look at what he says about the epigraph, because He shed so much light on it. I read it and reread it and thought, what are we talking about here? All I could make out was that we're talking in some kind of way about how to judge people, but I really wasn't following. So let me read you from Adam Roberts. He says, there's something odd about this epigraph. Thank goodness he said that. Makes me feel better. On its face, it seems straightforward. The first gentleman poses an important question. How do we judge human beings? Indeed, this is arguably the key question for Shakespeare, who returns to the disjunction between seeming and being over and over. And then he quotes Shakespeare, there's no art to find the mind's construction in the face. And so on, he says. And of course for Eliot too, he goes on. But Eliot's phrasing in this confected epigraph is strangely ambiguous between how do you judge men in general and what is your judgment with respect to this specific man? He dresses in fine clothes, but does his character match his outward array? When rephrased that way, the answer is obvious. Of course not. It would be as ridiculous, as the second gentleman says, in words that glance at the old proverb about not judging books by covers. It would be just as ridiculous to arrange one's library by size, or by binding, or, may I say it, cover colors. What is this with arranging books? That's a separate rant. I won't go into it, but, yes, they look lovely, but anyway, I think Dr. Cranky Pants, Nick at Dr. Cranky Pants, has done a rant on this already, and his is good. So just go watch the one where he sorts out his bookshelf and cleans it, because he has a little moment about sorting, arranging books by color. It's a good one. Anyway, back to Adam Roberts. He says, different books bound in the same kind of covers will, of course, contain many different kinds of content. Indeed, it's an observation so facile that it must send us back to the original epigraph. Is that all it's saying? Well, no. For one thing, there is the strange, surely, styling of books in a library as, quote, the drifted relics of all time. Not living things brought alive with every reader, but inert fossils. A relic is something left behind, something we have left behind. Books are here relinquished as texts with which to engage unread authors, while simultaneously being assembled, collected, sorted into library shelves. When we think of it like that, the point of the epigraph shifts its ground. It becomes not about how we read people. Indeed, it is very specifically about how we don't read people, but instead how we dispose of them after we have collected them. This is interesting. What kind of person collects other people? It speaks perhaps to a particular objectionable type of character, the sort of person who assembles friends and acquaintances not for the sake of those relationships or out of genuine interest or affection, but because those friends and acquaintances are perhaps famous, wealthy, or aristocratic, as social adornments, or for their social utility rather than as people. Whether we would necessarily call such a person a hypocrite, of course they might be a hypocrite, but it's uncertain. Perhaps their problem is rather the reverse of this, a too bold acceptance of the conventions of society on their own terms, a position pharisaical rather than common garden hypocritical, perhaps. This is because Eliot is using this epigraph to set up the first meeting of Lidgett and Bulstrode, and therefore to foreshadow the banker's eventual fall. It is Bulstrode in this exchange who seems better, but is worse beneath his cloak. That's a lovely thing about an open published book. You can quote from it at length and you don't have any worry about, oh my God, copyright. But it's a fantastic book and you can access it online. So as I say, go see the link in the description box because you can read the entire book or sample parts of it. If you're looking at Middlemarch, I think you can download it and then make it a searchable PDF. So you can look for the epigraph that you want to study and get the explanation. So you could devour it in pieces, which might be better for studying. But I think it's interesting that he talks about this idea of collecting people. What kind of people collect people and for what reasons do we gather the people around us? And when I thought about it, I thought, all the really bad things that you can do with friends and acquaintances, you can also do with books. Let me give you a list. So, for example, with either friends or books, you can insist that they always please or entertain you or make you feel comfortable. With friends or books, you can try to judge them rather than understand them. You can do that. With friends or books, you can have them in quantity but without any quality engagement. Yeah, we know that, right? And with friends or books, we can worry about whether they are popular or beautiful enough to make us look good to whoever it is we need to look good in front of, right? And with friends or with books, we can choose them just to make an impression on others without really liking them or caring about them one way or another. So I think, yeah, it's a fascinating analogy to talk about books and the collecting of books and the collecting of people and why we do it and how we interact with our books and with our friends, because there's good and bad ways to do both those things. And so as we go on in Middlemarch, I think we're going to have to bear that epigraph in mind as we watch Mr. Bulstrode, as we get to know him better. So we'll start reading the chapter. Here we go. In consequence of what he had heard from Fred, Mr. Vincey determined to speak with Mr. Bulstrode in his private room at the bank at 1:30, when he was usually free from other callers. But a visitor had come in at 1 o'clock, and Mr. Bulstrode had so much to say to him that there was little chance of the interview being over in half an hour. The banker's speech was fluent, but it was also copious, and he used up an appreciable amount of time in brief, meditative pauses. Do not imagine his sickly aspect to have been of the yellow, black-haired sort. He had a pale blonde skin, thin, grey, besprinkled brown hair, light grey eyes, and a large forehead. Loud men called his subdued tone an undertone, and sometimes implied that it was inconsistent with openness, though there seems to be no reason why a loud man should not be given to concealment of anything except his own voice, unless it can be shown that Holy Writ has placed the seat of candour in the lungs. So what do we see here? We see that Fred did speak to his father. We remember he was toying with the idea, finally decided it was probably his best course of action, so he worked up the courage, did so, and we don't know what kind of discussion happened between father and son, but we know that Mr. Vincey Sr. has taken it upon himself to do this unpleasant thing. And I'm interested in the time that he picked. He went at 1 o'clock. He went in 1:30, because at 1:30 he knew that Bulstrode did not usually have callers. Now, he could have just done that because then he didn't have to make an appointment, and maybe he didn't want any witnesses to what was happening, so he didn't want to have his name in a diary, for example, written down. Maybe he also didn't want to meet anybody else, seeing him coming in or out of that private room. If there was somebody else in there, they would know, oh, Mr. Vincey was in with Mr. Bulstrode. So perhaps he wanted to arrange the meeting such that, if possible, the only witnesses to that meeting were himself and Mr. Bulstrode. And did you find, or was it just me, but I began to wonder as this passage described Mr. Bulstrode's appearance, I thought, is he actually ill? And one has to be careful, because in real life you can misjudge whether or not someone has an illness. Yes, it's absolutely true, and you've got to be so careful. In fiction, writers they're supposed to give you clues, right? Everything they tell you about a character is supposed to be information that has a purpose. And yes, it's possible that I could be misjudging Mr. Bulstrode. He actually could be quite ill, but everything in his description suggests that he's just fine. Thank you. He's not. There probably isn't a great deal that's wrong with him, or at least not in a physiological sense. Perhaps in some other sense there might be. So I found it interesting. I also found it interesting, this emphasis on his undertone, on perhaps he speaks like this very quietly, and perhaps, and he's eloquent, and yet he doesn't raise his voice. And I don't know what that implies, except, of course, in my mind, if the phrase, "it's always the quiet ones," came to mind, that perhaps Mr. Bulstrode, it means that there's perhaps more to him than people think when he's speaking so quietly. Perhaps there's things they think he would never have done or never have seen that perhaps has done and seen. We'll go on reading now. Mr. Bulstrode had also a deferential, bending attitude in listening, and an apparently fixed attentiveness in his eyes, which made those persons who thought themselves worth hearing infer that he was seeking the utmost improvement from their discourse. Others, who expected to make no great figure, disliked this kind of moral lantern turned on them. If you are not proud of your cellar, there is no thrill of satisfaction in seeing your guest hold up his wine glass to the light and look judicial. Such joys are reserved for conscious merit. Hence, Mr. Bulstrode's close attention was not agreeable to the publicans and sinners in Middlemarch. It was attributed by some to his being a Pharisee, and by others to his being evangelical. This is where you have to just stop a moment, because there's an awful lot of comment here about Mr. Bulstrode's character and what people thought of it. So we'll stop. We should really talk about, and it's funny that the occasion hasn't happened yet, to talk about English evangelicalism in the early 19th century. It wasn't a lone movement in the United States. There was a similar movement called the Second Great Awakening. And basically, Dorothea Brooke, we could have used her as a kind of model, because what happened is subsequent to the French Revolution and in the early 19th centuries is people with faith began to be convinced that it was simply not enough to be a believer and go to church. Your faith had to be driving you to some kind of action which would not only improve yourself, but improve society in general. So outside the established church, there were groups like the Methodists who got a reputation for wanting to improve things socially. But within the Church of England, there was also an evangelical movement with theologians pushing people to think about their faith differently, more actively. We see that Mr. Bulstrode is among these, but there were many, many, many denominations that grew and gained strength alongside the Church of England in the early 19th century. So it's difficult to know exactly what the character of Mr. Bulstrode's religion is just by being told that he was possibly evangelical. It's like, oh, okay, that's not enough detail, because many groups were affected by this trend toward evangelicalism. And there was no one church, in case you're thinking that there was a church called the Evangelical Church. No, that's not what the evangelical movement in England was at the time. It was more about an attitude to what your faith should be, what it should be pushing you, motivating you to do, and less about what denomination you belong to. I did go looking, and I wanted to recommend a really good work about religion in 19th century England. Again, books were hard to find that were not pricey. If price is no issue, I did find Julie Melnick's book, Victorian Religion, and its copies vary between £40 and £100, depends where you buy them from. But yeah, they were quite pricey, but it does seem to be a good, detailed survey of what did religion mean to Victorian Britain, because it certainly drove a lot culturally at the time, but in different ways. So I think that's important. What I did find, of course, in good old JSTOR, my favorite source of all resources, was a fantastic journal article called Religion in the Novels of George Eliot. And so, since we have been reading outside sources, I'd like to read a couple of quotes here and later on from this source, because it's fascinating what it does have to say. This paragraph here that I'm going to read is talking specifically about Bulstrode. For our purpose, the most interesting character is Nicholas Bulstrode, so that the purpose being to talk about religion in Middlemarch. So it says, whose story is a vivid exposition of many of George Eliot's principal ideas about religion. Before he became the master of Middlemarch, banker, business partner in shady manufacturing enterprises, and chief doer of good works, he was a member of a dissenting church at Highbury and, quote, fond of theological definition. The church was significantly Calvinist. In Middlemarch, he had followed the custom of most newly rich in a provincial society, to which all dissenters were objects of scorn or distrust. And we see that in the passage, don't we? He had joined the established church, not Mr. Fairbrother's kind of church, however, but an evangelical and so possibly a Calvinist church where doctrine was preached, and which many of his neighbors regarded as a canting, hypocritical affair, words they reserved for anything which made of religion a rather serious matter, or savored of what they understood by Methodism. Now, he doesn't go on to say what they did understand by Methodism, but clearly for the English. And if I do ever eventually read Keith Thomas's book again, or reread it, which is, it's called Religion and the Decline of Magic in England, there's a long section which I can remember reading where he talks about how irreligious the English actually are, that as a nation culturally we're not disposed to serious religion. Now, the exception to that, of course, was the Puritan movement in the 17th century, but of course we exported a great number of those people after we brought back King Charles II. Obviously, that put a lot of people who had been dissenters and Puritans in danger of their lives, so I can't exactly blame them for getting on a boat and sailing across the Atlantic. Surely the danger would be, at least you were taking your chances, weren't you? It says something then about the cultural foundation of the United States of America as well, so the people that certainly went there, that settled the eastern seaboard, were looking for freedom to express very different religious ideas and very different political ideas. So yeah, there's that. But I'm digressing, because Middlemarch is England, so we'll stay in England for now. But certainly there is a distrust amongst the English, and it remains even now. Of course, now you could explain it. Now we have a secular society, but you could explain it. Even in the 19th century, there would have been a slight distrust of anyone who took their religion too seriously. And I know that sounds bizarre, like, well, how else are you supposed to take your religion? And I can't explain it. There is a cultural phenomenon, though, that religion it's nice, people are allowed to have it, but it's a very private thing. If you share it with people too much, or you talk about it a little too much, or you seem just a little too enthusiastic about it, generally that's a cultural turnoff. And what's interesting is I think it has been for some centuries. I don't think this is a 20th, 21st century phenomenon. But we really must get back to our text. So we're going back to where Eliot's narrator is talking about how Middlemarchers viewed Bulstrode and his religiosity. So it says, less superficial reasoners among them wished to know who his father and grandfather were. Now that's the real religion in England, is class. That's what they took seriously. Never mind about his religious principles. Who were his father and grandfather? And then the text goes on to say, observing that 25 years ago, nobody had ever heard of a Bulstrode in Middlemarch. In other words, not only was his family perhaps not wealthy or famous, he wasn't resident in the town in generations past, and that also mattered a great. To his present visitor, Lidgett, the scrutinizing look was a matter of indifference. So in other words, though other people were disturbed by Bulstrode's habit of giving them his full attention, perhaps too full, while they were speaking, Lidgett isn't taking in this scrutiny. Lidgett, it says, he simply formed an unfavorable opinion of the banker's constitution and concluded that he had an eager inward life with little enjoyment of tangible things. We'll come back to that. I shall be exceedingly obliged if you will look in on me here occasionally, Mr. Lidgett, the banker observed, after a brief pause. If, as I dare to hope, I have the privilege of finding you a valuable coadjutor in the interesting matter of hospital management, there will be many questions which we shall need to discuss in private. As to the new hospital, which is nearly finished, I shall consider what you have said about the advantages of a special destination for fevers. The decision will rest with me, for though Lord Medlicott has given the land and timber for the building, he is not disposed to give his personal attention to the object. So the first thing that strikes me is we know from the text the fact that Bulstrode refers to some discussion with Lidgett about having a separate ward on this hospital for fevers, that we're sort of at the end of this meeting that they started. So there's a lot of talking that we haven't seen. These seem to be almost the wrapping up remarks, because of course what Bulstrode starts out by saying is, I'd be obliged if you would look in on me here occasionally. It's what you tend to say at the end of a meeting is, when are we going to get together next time. So that seems to be the gist of it. So we know we're coming in toward the end. I found it amusing that Lidgett, in scrutinizing Bulstrode, just remarks immediately, makes a diagnosis of him, doesn't he? He says, he simply formed an unfavorable opinion of the banker's constitution and concluded that he had an eager inward life with little enjoyment of tangible things. And at the moment, I'm with Gareth. I've joined his Belief and Behavior bi-monthly book club. I had to say that very carefully. It's easy to trip over those words. And right now we're reading Oliver Sacks' book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And that's very interesting. A couple of times, Sacks admits that doctors have this habit of always diagnosing, always looking for symptoms, or as he says, far too concerned with defectology and far too little with narratology. That is, not interested in the person as a whole, their whole story, but just zooming in on signs, on little, what he calls deficit is neurology's favorite word. And in that sense, though, Lidgett isn't necessarily doing anything so different from the other Middlemarchers, and Adam Roberts, in his epigraph book, says this, and I'm going to read another passage because his comment on Lidgett is interesting. He says, Lidgett, immune to the moral lantern, makes a judgment based on medical, that is the banker's constitution, rather than social or conventional grounds. Nonetheless, his assessment is not so far removed from wider Middlemarch opinion. Bulstrode performs acts of charity and collects friendships, not for their own sake, but for the luster they cast upon his reputation, and certainly that may be why he's meeting with Lidgett. We will find out. He does not enjoy things in themselves. He bolsters his own ego, knowing as he does his own fundamental unworthiness. The thing is, a doctor is another kind of person who collects or assembles people. Physicians collect patients in order to attend to their health and in order to earn money, but also less for their own sakes and more as iterations of medical symptoms. The question for such a collection becomes not, is this person a saint, knave, pilgrim, or hypocrite, but what is their pathology and how might I address it? As with, in the case of doctors, Lidgett included, how shall I turn this person into a data point in my research? Adam Roberts goes on to say, I am the son of two doctors. I know from personal experience the extent to which they observed people and chatted to one another in terms of potential symptoms. And then he went on to talk about how family journeys by car were terrible because his parents would point at people in the streets and start diagnosing them to each other, which I found quite funny. We'll go on now and we'll read Lidgett's reply to Bulstrode's remarks. There are few things better worth the pains in a provincial town like this, said Lidgett. A fine fever hospital, in addition to the old infirmary, might be the nucleus of a medical school here, when once we get our medical reforms. And what would do more for medical education than the spread of such schools over the country? A born provincial man who has a grain of public spirit as well as a few ideas should do what he can to resist the rush of everything that is a little better than common towards London. Any valid professional aims may often find a freer, if not a richer field in the provinces. So now we know a little bit about Lidgett's personal ambition, aims. He wants to see improved medical facilities and improved medical education across the country, and he wants to begin to spearhead that. That's quite an ambition. Funny then that he should start in Middlemarch rather than in London. I mean, I get that what he's saying is everything goes to London, honestly, but at the same time, it's a bit strange to start this great revolution in Middlemarch, but nevertheless, he is. Now we'll go on and read how Eliot's narrator describes Lidgett. They say, one of Lidgett's gifts was a voice habitually deep and sonorous, yet capable of becoming very low and gentle at the right moment. About his ordinary bearing, there was a certain fling, a fearless expectation of success, a confidence in his own powers and integrity much fortified by contempt for petty obstacles or seductions of which he had had no experience. But this proud openness was made lovable by an expression of unaffected goodwill. Mr. Bulstrode perhaps liked him the better for the difference between them in pitch and manners. He certainly liked him better, as Rosamond did, for being a stranger in Middlemarch. One can begin so many things with a new person, even begin to be a better man. Couple of things I want to catch there. There aren't a lot of things in this section of text that are out of the ordinary, but just a few. The use of the word fling. If we go back to that, Eliot's narrator says, about his, that is Lidget's, ordinary bearing, there was a certain fling. Now, that word, if you go to the Oxford English Dictionary, it won't give you a definition of fling for the way Eliot has used it. So she's actually taken the word and done a bit of a Shakespeare thing with it, that is, used it in a way that you probably will figure out the meaning without any problem, but not in a way that it's been used quite before. So fling, we know as a verb, means to hurl or to move across. But as a noun, a fling usually meant a fit or a spell of unrestrained indulgence, just following one's impulses. But this business about his ordinary bearing, there was a certain fling. So it's almost adjectival. Fling is describing the nature of his bearing. And there is no adjectival use for the word fling, but Eliot is making it so. And so we have to almost figure it out. We go, okay, well, if a fling is a fit or spell of unrestrained indulgence, then it must be in the nature of Lidget to just throw himself at something unrestrainedly without really having thought about it too much. So we note that. That's a character point. And the other character point, just as important, perhaps more, is Mr. Bulstrode's remark as we end it. Mr. Bulstrode liked Lidget the better for the difference between them in pitch and manners. He certainly liked him the better, as Rosamond did, for being a stranger in Middlemarch. He likes Lidget because Lidget's a stranger. Lidget's new to Middlemarch. One can begin so many things with a new person. And then he goes on to say, even begin to be a better man. Why, Mr. Bulstrode? What do you mean? If you need to begin to be a better man, then we've got some backstory that's quite interesting. So there's our first foreshadowing of something about Bulstrode. Just that little hint. Why do you need to become a better man? What are you saying? Is there something you need to tell us? Well, looks like yes, and that's the reason we're reading the rest of the book. But we go on now, and we read Mr. Bulstrode's remarks. I shall rejoice to furnish your zeal with fuller opportunities, Mr. Bulstrode answered. I mean, by confiding to you the superintendence of my new hospital, should a maturer knowledge favour that issue, for I am determined that so great an object shall not be shackled by our two physicians. Indeed, I am encouraged to consider your advent to this town as a gracious indication that a more manifest blessing is now to be awarded to my efforts, which have hitherto been much withstood. With regard to the old infirmary, we have gained the initial point, I mean your election, and now I hope you will not shrink from incurring a certain amount of jealousy and dislike from your professional brethren by presenting yourself as a reformer. And Lidget replies, I will not profess bravery, said Lidget, smiling, but I acknowledge a good deal of pleasure in fighting, and I should not care for my profession if I did not believe that better methods were to be found and enforced there as well as everywhere else. The standard of that profession is low in Middlemarch, my dear sir, said the banker. I mean in knowledge and skill, not in social status, for our medical men are most of them connected with respectable townspeople here. My own imperfect health has induced me to give some attention to those palliative resources which the divine mercy has placed within our reach. I have consulted eminent men in the metropolis, and I am painfully aware of the backwardness under which medical treatment labours in our provincial districts. The first thing I noticed was how many words associated with Christian religiosity Bulstrode uses just in his everyday conversation. I'll read them out. Zeal, rejoice, advent, gracious, manifest blessing, divine mercy. So it suggests that there's, I don't know what it suggests. I was going to say, it suggests how seriously he takes his religion, but that's unfair to other people who take their religion very seriously but don't feel the need to sprinkle their conversation with Christian religious phrases or. because it doesn't always happen. So I don't know what it says. Maybe we will find out. Maybe it is a show. Maybe he feels like I have to put these into my conversation, otherwise you will not think I'm serious about my religion. Or he doesn't feel that he is serious unless he uses them. One thing did confuse me though, and it's this sentence. He says, I mean, by confiding to you, Lidgett, the superintendence of my new hospital, should a maturer knowledge favour that issue, for I am determined that so great an object shall not be shackled by our two physicians. Now this was, I couldn't make this one out. On the one hand, it seemed as though Bulstrode was encouraging Lidgett to do things that of a reforming nature and things that would aggravate the two older physicians in Middlemarch. We know them, they're Mr. Peacock and Mr. Wrench. But yet he uses this phrase, should a maturer knowledge favour that issue. What maturer knowledge? Or does he think Lidgett has the maturer knowledge? It doesn't seem that way, because he starts by saying, I'll rejoice to furnish your zeal with further opportunities. By confiding to you, that is, limiting to you, you will have full authority to supervise the new hospital. And then, comma, should a maturer knowledge favour that issue? So again, it feels like he's saying, but I just need to get somebody else's okay, if that's all right. And I don't know whose okay he's thinking of, because he immediately says that I hope that you will cause jealousy and a little bit of dislike with your professional brethren. So I really don't know where Mr. Bulstrode's going with that throwaway. It's not a throwaway phrase. He means it. I just don't understand what he means by it. And perhaps we'll have to find that out at a later point in the text. And this section, I found another occasion for humour, as one does in Middlemarch all over the place. We're joining Lidgett again. He's replying to Mr. Bulstrode's complaint that it's difficult to find a good medical practitioner. And he says, yes, with our present medical rules and education, one must be satisfied now and then to meet with a fair practitioner. As to all the higher questions which determine the starting point of a diagnosis, as to the philosophy of medical evidence, any glimmering of these can only come from a scientific culture, of which country practitioners have usually no more notion than the man in the moon. There we go. Lidgett's opinion of most doctors, they haven't come out of a scientific culture, and so they don't even know how to form a correct diagnosis, what evidence to look for. Mr. Bulstrode, it says, bending and looking intently, found the form which Lidgett had given to his agreement not quite suited to his comprehension. I think that's a lovely way of saying Mr. Bulstrode had really no idea what Mr. Lidgett was talking about at this point. So Mr. Bulstrode can't be said to have any more notion of a scientific culture than the man in the moon. But he knows how to act under these circumstances. If you're out of your depth, if you don't really know what's going on, if you're not clear, what does the narrator say? Under such circumstances, a judicious man changes the topic and enters on ground where his own gifts may be more useful. In other words, just move the subject away. That way, it won't be revealed that you don't know much more than these country doctors you are criticizing. And so we go on with Bulstrode now. Here he is switching the topic. I am aware, he said, that the peculiar bias of medical ability is towards material means. Nevertheless, Mr. Lidgett, I hope we shall not vary in sentiment as to a measure in which you are not likely to be actively concerned, but in which your sympathetic concurrence may be an aid to me. You recognize, I hope, the existence of spiritual interests in your patients. Certainly I do, but those words are apt to cover different meanings to different minds. Precisely. And on such subjects, wrong teaching is as fatal as no teaching. Now, a point which I have much at heart is to secure a new regulation as to clerical attendance at the old infirmary. The building stands in Mr. Fairbrother's parish. You know Mr. Fairbrother? I have seen him. He gave me his vote. I must call to thank him. He seems a very bright, pleasant little fellow, and I understand he is a naturalist. Mr. Fairbrother, my dear sir, is a man deeply painful to contemplate. I suppose there is not a clergyman in this country who has greater talents. Mr. Bulstrode paused and looked meditative. Uh-oh, our first hitch. So many things to say. First of all, I think it's interesting that Bulstrode moves away from medical matters because, yes, he's out of his depth, and he quickly switches and he says, I hope that, Lidget, you're interested in the spiritual interests of your patients. And of course, Lidget says, yes, but, I wouldn't want to say what spiritual interests means. As he says, apt to cover different meanings to different minds. And Bulstrode thinks, I'm on my territory now. And he says, precisely. And then he takes the conversation in a direction I don't think Lidget would be expecting, because he says, and on such subjects, wrong teaching is as fatal as no teaching. And oh my goodness, I had flashbacks at that point. If you've been in a fundamentalist church, that sort of phrase, wrong teaching is just as bad as no teaching. It sounds really familiar. Yeah, because teaching, the right beliefs mattered. Anyway, so this is Bulstrode. And of course, he wants to gauge Lidget's opinion of Mr. Fairbrother, who at the moment, it seems, is the cleric looking after anyone in the infirmary, just because it's his parish. And Lidget has a perfectly almost neutral opinion of him, just thinks he seems an all right fellow. And then Mr. Bulstrode comes in and, oh my goodness, a man deeply painful to contemplate. Wow. Okay, you need to explain that. And then, of course, he tries to, I guess, soften the blow of what he said by saying, I suppose there is not a clergyman in this country who has greater talents. But then he goes quiet, like, I'm not going to expound any of those because personally, I don't think he does. It's interesting here. Interesting opinions. And of course, you have to ask the question now, wait a second. We're talking about a hospital here. Why on earth is Bulstrode so concerned about what kind of clergyman happens to be available to people in that hospital? Wait, is Bulstrode, what does he think, is he really interested in a hospital for what a hospital is for? Or is he got some kind of other motive, other agenda for wanting to be so involved in the building of a new hospital? And now we sort of get the strange sense that maybe there's two different things going on here. There's Lidget's agenda, which is medical and is about improving medical treatment and medical education. And then there's Bulstrode. And I as we read on, we're going to see, I'm not sure that Bulstrode really, it bothers him at all what goes on in the hospital medically speaking, which is interesting because he seems to say that it does. Although what he also seems to be saying is, I only care that you annoy the older doctors. So, and seem to be doing something reforming. Okay, interesting. But again, I'm not sure why. This is a very interesting relationship that I'm glad that we're going to learn more about. And so in response to Mr. Fairbrother saying, I suppose there is not a clergyman in this country who has greater talents, Mr. Lidget goes on to say, I have not yet been pained by finding any excessive talent in Middlemarch, said Lidget, bluntly. Well, he certainly did. So in other words, he's saying, you can compliment anyone you want. I've not seen anybody who's outstanding in this country town. Fine. Bulstrode doesn't seem to really catch any of that. He goes on to say, what I desire, because maybe that's the whole point why Bulstrode makes conversation with anybody, what I desire, said Mr. Bulstrode continued, looking still more serious, is that Fairbrother's attendance at the hospital should be superseded by the appointment of a chaplain, of Mr. Tyke, in fact, and that no other spiritual aid should be called in. Wow. Okay. So people don't even get a choice. They can't even ask for someone else. It's Mr. Tyke or nobody. And Mr. Lidget goes on to say, as a medical man, I could have no opinion on such a point unless I knew Mr. Tyke, and even then, I should require to know the cases in which he was applied. Lidget smiled, but he was bent on being circumspect. In other words, he's already beginning to think, I'm not sure what I'm agreeing to here. I'm going to be very careful. And Bulstrode says, of course you cannot enter fully into the merits of this measure at present, but here Mr. Bulstrode began to speak with a more chiseled emphasis. The subject is likely to be referred to the medical board of the infirmary, and what I trust I may ask of you is that in virtue of the cooperation between us, which I now look forward to, you will not, so far as you are concerned, be influenced by my opponents in this matter. Wow, okay, that's basically making it clear. I've done something for you, this is what I need you to do in return. Lidgett says, I hope I shall have nothing to do with clerical disputes, said Lidgett. The path I have chosen is to work well in my own profession. Now that's nice. That's a nice way of just pulling out of it, but he must be thinking, whoa, wait a second, what's going on here? It's interesting how Mr. Bulstrode then goes on to say, my responsibility, Mr. Lidgett, is of a broader kind. What, broader than medicine? Never mind. With me, indeed, this question is one of sacred accountableness. What an interesting choice of phrase. Who is accountable and for what? So he goes on to say, whereas with my opponents, I have good reason to say that it is an occasion for gratifying a spirit of worldly opposition. But I shall not therefore drop one iota of my convictions or cease to identify myself with that truth which an evil generation hates. I have devoted myself to this object of hospital improvement, but I will boldly confess to you, Mr. Lidgett, that I should have no interest in hospitals if I believed that nothing more was concerned therein than the cure of mortal diseases. I have another ground of action, and in the face of persecution, I will not conceal it. Mr. Bulstrode's voice had become a loud and agitated whisper as he said the last words. There we certainly differ, said Lidgett, but he was not sorry that the door was now opened, and Mr. Vincey was announced. That's as far as we'll go, but oh my word, that little paragraph outburst from Bulstrode, which takes up the top of page 127. Again, if we look for religious vocabulary, we've got spirit of worldly opposition, convictions, truth, evil generation hates, devoted myself, and persecution. So the whole business of what Mr. Bulstrode is doing is taking on this almost apocalyptic cast. It's like, this isn't just building a new hospital or even the wing of a new hospital onto an existing infirmary in a little country town in England. This is now a great battle between good and evil. This is, I don't know, Lucifer falling from heaven with Michael pursuing him. And I don't know, but the language that he's using and how heated he's becoming suggests that Mr. Bulstrode sees something in what he's doing that is just, Lidgett is just, what? Yeah, we differ. Like, I'm sorry, what's going on here? And of course, Bulstrode has really to say, I should have no interest in hospitals if I believed that nothing more was concerned therein than the cure of mortal diseases. It's like, but that is a hospital. That is the definition of a hospital. He says, I have another ground of action. So he's naked in his admission that there's an agenda, that he's got another agenda. And it makes me think, wow, would it matter if it was a hospital or a prison or a home for orphans, or would it even matter? Is Bulstrode really just looking for a captive audience that he can evangelize? We wonder. Going back to that article called Religion in the Novels of George Eliot, there the author finds a quote from Fairbrother, which will come up later in the novel, but we'll quote it for now because I think it's cool. It's Fairbrother saying, I am opposed to Bulstrode in many ways. I don't like the set he belongs to. They are a narrow, ignorant set and do more to make their neighbours uncomfortable than to make them better. Their system is a sort of worldly spiritual cliquism. They really look on the rest of mankind as a doomed carcass, which is to nourish them for heaven. Wow. Okay. So there we go. We're starting to get our introduction to Bulstrode, and he's not looking good. I'm not warming to him, and I can imagine a lot of you aren't either. But that's where we're going to end because Mr. Vincey is about to come in. So we're going to cover that next time. But before I go, I did want to just talk about something. I think I mentioned a little way, it might have been the last meditation, I have forgotten already, but I did talk about how soon can I get through Middlemarch. So how long is it going to take me with meditations for us to get through the book? And I did some calculations, and it was a little bit sort of, it was one of those moments, because I realized it was going to take me about 5 years another 5 years. And not that I care, because I think it's a lovely long project to be getting on with, but I thought, I wonder if I can shorten that a little bit. And I have talked, haven't I, about what about devoting a month in every year to Middlemarch meditations, where that's all the content I do maybe for a month, or that's all the content I create on a Sunday, because it's easier. These take a little longer to edit. So it's easier to do them on a Sunday. And I was thinking March is coming. And I mean, March begins with M. Middlemarch has the word March in it. So what would everybody think? I'll do a little poll, but I'd say, would you like it if for the month of March, every single Sunday was a Middlemarch episode, a Middlemarch meditation episode? We could do it again in May. Also, if you wanted to, I was thinking again, the 2 M months, just have a real drive to cover material so that we get through the book a little bit quicker. It's not going to, I don't think it's going to shave a year off. It might make it 4.5 years instead of 5. And I don't know. I don't feel bad about that. I don't want you to think I'm thinking, oh, well, I won't do it then if it's going to take that long. I guess I'm more thinking of you, the audience. I'm thinking, wow, guys, this is a 5-year project. Are you up for it? Or if you're reading Middlemarch now and you're thinking, wow, I wish all the meditations existed now, I'm thinking, oh, sorry, it's going to be a while, but please feel free to read the book as slowly as I am. My feeling is, I don't think that's a bad way. I'm also doing War and Peace very slowly, and I'm going to talk about that in another video. That is just been, that's a brilliant way to read classics. That is 19th century novels that are big and clunky with long sentences. Best thing to do is slow down like crazy. That makes them a totally different thing. Not so onerous, not such a burden, not so dull and dry, because why? Well, you're not just trying to devote hours of your time. You're just giving it a few minutes here and then here and then here. And it's amazing how you get through the book, and also you get to understand it better. And that's what I'm hoping these meditations are doing, is just helping people to open out this book and see more to it. Just see how much thought George Eliot put into this creation, because it's quite astounding. Anyway, that's enough of that. Like I'm not preaching to the converted who know much of this already. Thanks everybody for joining me. In a few days' time, I've got a fiction review for you because I've just finished another book. And talk to you again then. Happy reading in the meantime. Take care. Bye-bye.